Social psychology is the study of how groups and groups' behaviors affect the behavior of an individual. It's different from sociology. Sociology is looking at group behavior, whereas social psychology is looking at an individual's behavior and how the group is influencing that individual's behavior. We're going to talk basically about three different influences. One is the cognitive influence, one is the behavioral or emotional influence, and one is the sort of malevolence. One bad apple can corrupt the group, or does the group corrupt the one good apple? And so we'll look at three different researchers: Solomon Asch, Stanley Milgram, and Phil Zimbardo. And those researchers cover these areas with some experiments that are very, very interesting. I'll tell you generally, social psychology is. A definition might be the real, imagined, or implied presence of others' effect on an individual's behavior. So social psychology can even apply in situations like, say, where I'm here by myself, right? There can be some element or an effect of an implied presence of others in that there are trails, right? There are trails where people walk, where deer walk, where others walk, and that affects my sort of self-consciousness that other people might be out here walking on these trails, and I might be looking like some weirdo who's shooting a selfie for YouTube or something. I am doing that, but I'm teaching you for that very purpose. But the implied presence of others, no one's here. I'm by myself. And yet there is this societal pressure of the implied presence of another. I hear a helicopter right now. It's the sheriff's helicopter. Uh-oh. That's an implied presence of others too. You ever see a speed limit sign? And why don't you just drive as fast as you want to go anywhere? Many of you do. Stop it. That's bad for you. You can kill yourself and others. But the reason you don't is that there's an implied presence of a law enforcement officer who might write you a ticket, and it's going to cost you money, right? There's a judge who might throw you in jail if you're reckless driving or something. So you really want to be careful about those other things, and your perception of others is an important thing. So social psychology affects or investigates and tries to understand the effect that other people, whether they're present or not, have on you, right? Allport, who we talked about in the last chapter, was also a social psychologist. Hans Eysenck was a social psychologist. And these people were studying the impacts of the group on the individual. Your perception of other people impact your behavior. And if they don't, you're a sociopath, right? If you're somebody who's only into your own behavior and only focus, or you might be an immature person, right? So we think of like the selfishness of like a baby. That's not a bad thing, because the babies aren't wrong, right? They need the support when they're tiny infants, and we have to listen to them and take care of their needs. But as we grow older, we have to integrate ourselves into the group. We have to listen to the group. Social psychology cross-culturally has very different impacts as well, because here in the United States, we have the perception of individualism, and that's a big boon for our society, our culture, but it also is a detriment to us in the way that we don't take direction from the group as well as, say, Oriental cultures, right? Our Occidental nature, Occidental meaning West, Oriental meaning from the East. That doesn't mean I'm a racist. But we have different cultural values, and we see individualism here in the Occidental side of human society as being more focused on individuals, and then does that change the social psychological impacts? What we see is, even though we're individualistic in our orientation, we are very susceptible to group dynamics. In fact, groupthink is something that a lot of people can get into, and it's sort of this way of not thinking, right? Group thinking is just allowing the group sort of narrative to stand for you, and to overcome some cognitive dissonance you might be feeling about a particular topic. You might use groupthink to sort of minimize the stress involved with having that cognitive dissonance. But the group can affect our behavior. This was shown demonstratively in a cognitive sense, that it can change your perceptions by a man named Solomon Asch. He did an experiment that was quite ingenious, and Solomon Asch's experiment used Confederates. Again, not racist people, but people who knew what was happening, and that's what a Confederate is in an experiment like this. but they appeared to be people who were being experimented upon. They appeared to be the ones who were subjects of the experiment, or we call them participants now, they called them subjects then. But you'd have a group of, say, 5 people sitting around a table, and 4 of those 5 people were actually in on it. They were in on the experiment, and they knew what Solomon Asch was doing, and they were instructed to act a part, right, to behave in a certain way. And so here's the scenario. Asch put up 3 lines, A, B, and C. You've probably seen this, it's in your book. And then a reference line. It says, okay, see this reference line. Which one of those lines, A, B, or C, is the same length as this reference line? And they started with the Confederates answering first. They would say, okay, you answer. And so the person would say, let's say that this is the line and here's 3 lines, right? Which one of these is like the other? Obviously my index fingers are the same length. Here, I'll do this one, that way it's demonstrative. But A, B, and C, you're looking at it and you're thinking, oh, obviously A is the same as the reference line. Well, what ended up happening was the Confederates, instead of saying A, they would say B. And the person who's actually not in on the experiment, the one who was being experimented upon, they immediately, as soon as they hear the person say the wrong thing, I mean, it's a simple cognitive task to see which line is the same as the other. It's not difficult. But what starts happening in that person's mind is they start to rationalize and think, maybe that person's wrong, Probably they thought, no, they're wrong, they got it wrong, I'll get it right, I know it's A. But then the next person in the line, right, they're the last person, the one who's being experimented upon is going to answer last. And the next person says, it's B. Again, blows the mind of the participant in this experiment. They go, no, it's not B, it's A. And that's what they're thinking in their mind. They're not saying this because it's socially inappropriate to answer out of turn. These are probably college students who are being experimented upon, the white rats of psychology. And they're having a lot of struggles. This is a stress-inducing environment because 2 people have now said B when clearly the answer, that the reference line is the same length as A. Well, the 3rd person answers B as well. And the 4th person answers B as well. By this time, the actual person, the participant in the experiment, is thinking, I must have missed something. I must be the one who's wrong. I must be the one who is not considering what was said. I may have missed some instructions, right? They try to rationalize in their mind why these 4 other people have answered incorrectly. And it really is a struggle for that person. And so it's causing a lot of turmoil in their brain. And so what do? Most people inevitably answer not what they thought was the correct answer, but what the group said was the correct answer. They mostly say B. Solomon Asch and his cognitive experimentation in conformity, showing that people would conform to the group. Again, there were people, probably like me, who are the sort of contrarians that go, nope, it's A. And that's good in a sense and that's bad in a sense. It's good in the sense that oftentimes we need to critique the group's answers as a check to see if the group's correct. But other times that can be bad. And so you see why people have developed this sense of deferring to the group's answer, because it allows for social cohesion and it allows for a connectedness to others. If you say it's A and everybody else is saying it's B, you look like the crazy one. And that's something that people really want to avoid. That's a tense, stress-inducing environment when you are the naysayer. It's difficult. But we'll see in the next experiments why it's important that there are people who are willing to go against that particular proclivity humans have, which is to defer to the group rather than to answer as their individual subjective experience tells them. What we'll see in the next segment is that it even affects our behaviors. When we talk about Stanley Milgram and we see how his experiment displayed that humans' behaviors are not about their own, that they are subjected to attributions of others. Another aspect of social psychology is how poorly we as humans look at others' behavior. The fundamental attribution error. When you think about the fundamental attribution error, you have to understand that your perspective is a subjective one. While this is our proclivity, our natural reaction is to do this, you can overcome it. If you're looking at my videos and you're like, I'm so bored by these videos. You might be thinking to yourself, this guy's a really boring video creator. Instead, what you're doing is you're putting the blame on your boredom on me, rather than saying that there's multiple things that could be causing your boredom. It could be you have to take online classes this semester. It could be that you are struggling to make good choices and I'm a bad video maker, right? It's not just that, but we put this fundamental attribution on error and we say that other person's a bad video maker. You might be thinking that, but it might just be that maybe I make great videos in other settings, but this setting I'm struggling in. So it might be a contextual thing for me. It's not necessarily I'm a bad video maker. It's just that what you're seeing now, you're attributing a characteristic to me that is unfair given the contextual circumstances. And you're making it a personal one, like he's always that way. That's the fundamental attribution error. That's the way we think. But then when something bad happens to us, when we think of a bad grade on a test, we go, that was a bad test. Not, I didn't adequately prepare for that test, or I don't understand this topic as well as I should. We don't make those claims about our own frailties, and that's natural, right? You, however, can learn to embrace your frailties, because learning to be in error is the true way of scholarship. I found 2,000 ways not to do it. And so he was really okay with his errors. And he wasn't saying, I can't ever do it, or I don't have the personal characteristics to do it. He had the fortitude and the perseverance that allowed him to look wholeheartedly at his errors and learn from them, right? So he didn't do the same mistakes again. And when we see others make errors, we blame them personally rather than their context, right? We make excuses for ourselves based on saying it wasn't, we lost that game because, we just were tired today, or it was just the context that we worked too hard yesterday in practice. Not that the other team was better than, and that's something that people have a natural tendency to do. There's also the just world hypothesis, which gives us a bias towards others who are suffering, who are encountering opposition and victimization. It's wishful thinking, and it's just not a reality. So understand that the just world hypothesis, it leads us towards a bias of understanding when bad things happen to people, we have a tendency to think they must have been implicated in it. We're learning as a society to guard against that tendency. The next topic is going to be about Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments. To set the stage, you have to go back to when Milgram, remember he was a student of Gordon Allport at Harvard. He was now at Yale, and he was confronting some things in the post-World War II era people really hadn't considered before, and that was this darkness, this malevolent and violent nature that was shown so brutally in the Holocaust. And I would suggest, moreover, in dropping bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Humans have a proclivity for seeking death of others. It's something that's so shocking and so hard to take in. It's so hard to incorporate, as Jung calls it, your shadow, or elements of your shadow. It's difficult to think about the fact that you could do that. In fact, after it was revealed what happened in Nazi Germany, millions of Jews were kept in concentration camps, labor camps, and burned in ovens, shot and buried, worked to death, starved to death, experimented on. When the US populace became aware of this, it shocked them to the core. And they did something that you probably would recognize if you remember 9/11, which was they began to think all people who shared ancestry with those evil Nazis must be like them. And so there was huge anti-German sentiment. Now, Germany is not the Nazis, right? The Nazis were the Socialist Party of Germany who won power and took power and abused it. It's not all German people. That's like saying all of America is one political party. It's not true. It was difficult for Americans to understand how German people could even allow that to happen. If you ever saw Steven Spielberg's movie Schindler's List, it's about a man who is not Jewish, but he's an absolute hero, and he allowed for his resources and assets to be deployed to save many, many Jewish people from the concentration camps and inevitable death at the hands of the Nazis. So people started to discriminate against German folks. People dropped their German names, right? They changed their names to not be German. They stopped talking about their German ancestry. It became very unpopular to be German because of the association with that. Stanley Milgram became interested in how could seemingly good people, the Germans, fall victim to the Nazi Party and then comply with their evil, malevolent, violent, aggressive behaviors and requests. You know, most people like to think that they'd be Schindler, but that wasn't what happened for most people. Most people were complicit or didn't speak out against the evils, the atrocities that occurred in the Holocaust. That's something to note. And Milgram set out to experiment on Americans to see, were we susceptible to the same thing? So he's at Yale, that's in New Haven, Connecticut. He sends out an advertisement in the newspaper. That's how they did it in the day, to sort of gather interest in participating in a study. And he had a bunch of subjects come in. He employed a similar strategy that Solomon Asch had employed with Confederates, but in this situation, he just had one person with the subject who was being experimented upon. And he set up a scenario where he said that they were testing punishment's effect on learning. And so here's the scenario. He has this person who doesn't know what's happening come into the lab and meet another person they think is also in the experiment, but that person's just an actor. They meet this guy wearing a white lab coat, dressed in, Yale regalia for scholarship and academics. And he says, I'm the researcher. I'm researching this particular study on punishment's effect on learning. You two have been asked to participate in this. And he says, you've been paid, which means they've been given the money for the participation in the study. And he says, you can leave at any time. Then what he says is, let's randomize you. Let's make one of you the teacher and one of you the learner. It's not random, it's a trick. And they basically, the actor says, oh, I'll be the learner, picks out, draws a name out of a hat, says, oh, I'm the learner. And both of the little pieces of paper in the hat said teacher. So that regardless of whether they experimented upon subject picked either of them, it would still say teacher. Remember, this person's being experimented upon, the other person's an actor who's pretending to be experimented upon. Then the professor, also an actor, takes them into a side room and hooks up the learner, who's an actor, to electrodes and puts contact paste on here and hooks them up and clasps their arms down and straps them in a chair and allows them to use their fingers to respond by pushing these buttons on some sort of a console, has a microphone in front of them, and then shuts the door and takes the teacher, this is the real person being experimented on, back to what looks like this giant mechanistic box with a bunch of levers on it. And he explains to the person who's being experimented upon, remember, they think they're being a teacher, that they're going to read a list of word pairs to the person in the other room via a microphone that goes over to a console and a speaker in the other room. And they'll say word pairs like cup, ball, girl, dog, lime, apple. And then what they're going to have to do is reread that list and say cup. And then the learner is going to have to say the word that goes with cup, ball, or girl. And then the learner will have to say dog, right? That's the word that's paired together. This is sort of the memory. And then the professor, again, an actor who's pretending to be a researcher, says if they miss and you say lime and they say orange, which is incorrect, you have to push this switch, which is going to apply electric shock to them. You saw them hooked up in the other room, and it'll start off at this level, and you push this and it shocks them as the punishment for missing. We want to see if that punishment affects their learning. And with each successive miss, you just go up one level to the next level of shock, which it shows on there the number of volts that are being applied during these shocks. The teacher sits down at the console and begins reading the list of words, then begins to shock when they miss. Remember, this is all pre-recorded. No one actually got shocked in the experiment for missing words. This was a setup. The teacher was the one being experimented upon. What we found in people's behavior in this scenario was not something that researchers expected, was not something that experts in the field, not something that psychiatrists who had been polled before this study was conducted. Milgram went around to a bunch of psychiatrists and said, hey, here's my experimental setup. How many of these people do you think will continue to shock the person up until the very last shock button? And most psychiatrists said, look, there's only, 2% of people might be like sociopaths so much that they would do that. So, less than 1% of your subjects are going to shock all the way up to the highest level, right? That would just be evil and malevolent to inflict that amount of pain on some random person for a non-trivial thing, right? Or for a trivial thing, like learning words in an experiment at Yale. The psychiatrist predicted that very, very few, less than 1%, would shock all the way to the end. What devastated people was that despite the recorded actor's voice screaming out in pain and agony, asking for relief, asking to be let out, people continued to shock and continue to shock. Most people continued to do something that they thought was harming another person. Now you might ask yourself, well, why did they do it? Why did they do that? Well, the researcher, the actor who's playing a researcher in the room, continued to say authoritative sentences, phrases to them when they would protest, when the teacher would say, hey, it sounds like he's hurting there. We should go check on him. The researcher, teacher guy, would say, the researcher who was the actor would say to the teacher, the experiment requires that you continue. While these shocks may be painful, they're not harmful. He would say things like that and continuously say them over and over again. The experiment requires that you continue. They'd say, I don't want to do this. I don't want to hurt somebody. I don't want to be responsible. You'd say, well, don't worry. I'm responsible. The experiment requires that you continue. Well, what if something happens to that one? I'm responsible if something happens to them. You keep on keeping on. And what we found in this experiment is that we are compliant and obedient to authority figures. That actor playing a researcher really had no academic appointment at Yale, really wasn't some sort of eminent authority figure, but our perception. I say our because this experiment has been redone in more recent times. Even though people know about it, we're able to do this experiment and find that people still have a predilection towards following orders. Most of us we'd like to think that we would say no. Most of us would like to think we'd be Schindler. Most of us would have been the Nazi guards, either actively involved or complicit in what happened. A book that was published later, snuck out of the Soviet USSR, Soviet Union, by Solzhenitsyn, really cataloged the complicity that most people faced when they were having the oppressive fascist government, the socialist government, inform on people and disappear people and send people out to these work camps in a different scenario than the Nazis, but not too dissimilar. And most of us like to think that we would stand up and protect people who are vulnerable, and these experiments tell us we won't. Now, not to be all doom and gloom, we learned a lot of great stuff from Milgram's experiment. In fact, we learned what can be done in order to prevent us from falling into that scenario, that behavioral pattern where we are complicit in allowing somebody to become victim of a crime or victim of, in that case, genocide. And Milgram's experiment showed a couple things. He didn't just do it with one teacher and one learner. Sometimes he ran the experiment where he would have two teachers. And if there was two teachers and any dissent was made manifest in the room, was allowed to continue, people would stop. They'd say, nope, I'm not doing this anymore. If one other person in the room said, I don't want to hurt this person, I don't want to continue. Remember, nobody was hurt. Well, that's not true. The people who were being experimented upon were hurt because of their internal struggle, right? The cognitive dissonance they experienced. It's wrong to hurt another person, and I'm being told by an authority figure to do so, right? I'm being commanded to obey this illegal order. What we learned from it is that if there's a dissenter, if there's an element of dissent, that allows most people to get a perspective on it that they don't have, and to not comply and not to be obedient, but to say, I'm done with this. I am not going to participate in an experiment where I'm harming another individual. Most of us, when we're by ourselves, and I say us because this applies to us and it's been replicated, again, similar findings, not the same, but similar findings about the vast majority of people are going to comply and obey the instructions of these researchers, even though they think they're harming another person. Now, it gets bad. In the end of the recordings that the actor did, the actor screams and then stops responding. They hear a thud from the other room, and then they get no more responses from the learner. The experimenter presses the teacher and tells them continue to apply shocks if they don't respond. If you think about that, if you're in the teacher's situation, your perception is the person there is either incapacitated, unconscious, or dead. And we don't like to think that we would do this. And yet this experiment shows us we're susceptible to this type of scenario. We need to be vigilant against it. We need to be able to speak up when we find ourselves in a situation where the authority is saying something that is unethical, something that is immoral, something that violates our basic understanding of human value, dignity, and worth. And I really do think that our society has learned from these experiments that we have proclivity towards this malevolence, that we have this individual nature inside of us that will do harm. Not that we want to. It's not that people are, as a base, evil, but they have evil potentiality within them. So how do we combat it? Dissent. How do we dissent? We try to make sure that we speak up and we tell others when we find something to be immoral, when we find something to be unethical, that we say it so that other people know that that's a thought other people are having. If you don't know about the fact that humans do this, if you disagree with me that good, ordinary men could do this, go read the book Ordinary Men. If you don't believe that good, ordinary people could do this, go look at My Lai's massacre. Go look at atrocities in war and ask yourself, wow, is it just that all those guys got together and we're all just terrible, evil individuals? Or is there something else that's influencing it at play? And how do we guide ourselves so that we don't fall victim to that same human natural behavior? And that leads us to Phil Zimbardo's work, the Stanford prison. So, Phil Zimbardo and the Stanford prison experiment. This is a classic study in psychology that was conducted by Phil Zimbardo at Stanford in the early 70s. He was having his own sort of existential crisis and trying to figure out the age-old question of whether the fundamental attribution error is right in some sense. He was trying to say, could you take good people and corrupt them? Or are they just good? So what he did was he took normal college students and asked them to volunteer. He was paying them, and he divided them equally into two groups. One group he randomly selected to be the prisoners, and one group he randomly selected to be the guards. Again, they all came from the same group, and he surveyed them and made sure that they did not have sort of any form of underlying psychopathology by asking them if they had treatment by physicians or therapists for mental disorders, right? So he screened them out. These are normal college-age students at Stanford. Half of them get arbitrarily selected to be a prisoner. Half of them arbitrarily get selected to be a guard. Then what he did is he retrofitted the basement of the psychology building at Stanford and took offices and turned them into prison cells, right? Put bars on the windows, put little cots in there, and made up outfits for the prisoners, which were like these smocks with a number on them, and made outfits for the guards, which were this sort of military-esque drab tan look, and gave them whistles and told them to guard the prisoners. What ended up happening, and he put closed circuit cameras around the entire experiment, so he recorded all this. He had tons and tons of recording of this experiment as it happened. What happened after that was really interesting. Everything went totally normally. The prisoners were taken, their possessions were taken away, they were given these clothes, and they put on these little hair nets and walked into the cells and sat there for a while. Sooner than later, however, things really started to go awry, and the guards started to treat the prisoners sadistically, and the prisoners started to revolt and rebel against the authority. Now, what's super interesting about this is that these prisoners were not prisoners. These guards were not guards. They were all just normal people. All that was happening was that they were in a situation where they were told, you're a prisoner, you're a guard. They were given the implements of it. None of those boys had committed crimes. None of them had undergone law enforcement training. And yet what they enacted was a really evil, malevolent, sadistic environment. And people were hurt. Not physically, the guards were told not to hit them, but they made them do demeaning tasks. They made them dehumanize themselves. They made them do disgusting things. So Zimbardo takes these normal college students and assigns them to randomly be a prisoner or a guard. Everything goes smoothly initially, but then guards fall into a very sadistic way of treating the prisoners poorly. The prisoners revolt and are very rude and disrespectful to their fellow experimentees, right? And this is all caught on tape. Zimbardo's loving it, right? He's also playing the role of the Stanford prison warden. And so some of these prisoners undergo some real psychological issues, and he actually releases one of them and gets an alternate to come in and be another prisoner. There's all sorts of drama going around, and there's going to be an attempt to escape, and the one who was let out, he's going to try and get friends and family to come liberate the prisoners. And these boys really fell victim to playing the part and believing it, doing method acting, so to speak. They were really experiencing pain and trauma and sadistic, evil behaviors on all sides, including Zimbardo. In fact, his graduate student came in to his office, and she looked at what was happening, and they were making the prisoners scrub toilets with their toothbrushes. That's what the prisoners were making, the prison guards were making the prisoners do. And she basically said to him, you've lost perspective. You're hurting people, and that's wrong. Stop it. And he was supposed to do this experiment for a long time, and he cut it short because he realized, oh, yeah, I kind of got wrapped up in this. I started playing my role too much as the prison warden, right? Trying to make this work. He had investment in all of this effort and assets, and it was his work. And he was really wrapped up in it working, and it was working, and he thought it was fantastic. But then he didn't realize, maybe he did realize, but he neglected the fact that he was hurting people. And so when she came in and sort of alighted him to that reality, he shut down the experiment. And then he later married that same lady, his graduate student. It's weird how that happens in graduate school. A little unethical. So that's Zimbardo's experiment. He became probably the most famous psychologist, living psychologist. He became the president of the APA, the American Psychological Association. He directed and promoted this film that you guys will watch, Quiet Rage, and he wrote a book called The Lucifer Effect when we started to see what was happening in the Abu Ghraib prison, where prisoners of war that were taken by American forces were treated horrifically and were abused and harassed in ways that totally violated the Geneva Convention or any just sense of rationally treating another human being. They did really terrible things to these prisoners of war. And his book, The Lucifer Effect, really dialogues about how people have this propensity towards evil behavior in a bad context, right? So he explains in The Lucifer Effect that, look, you're sending 18-year-old, 19-year-old boys and girls to a foreign country. They've never been out of the country. They've barely been out of their parents' house, barely through basic training. You're sending them to a foreign country and telling them to be in charge of people that you're telling them are going to kill them and are terrorists and have done all this horrible stuff. The context they're in isn't the best one for an 18-year-old who now is given this massive authority of imprisoning another human being. It's not a good context for them to be in. It's not a good context for anybody, even the most veteran, wise person around. It's a difficult situation. So to expect them to just be perfect in that is really unfounded. And The Lucifer Effect became a big hit. He went on all the Today Show and Oprah and all that stuff. And Zimbardo became, the most famous psychologist, I think. I think he's the most famous one. Maybe Jordan Peterson's more famous than him now. But he was big time for a long time. Also, he used to give a scholarship every year at my previous, the university I taught at in New York, Brooklyn College. That's where he went, and he would come back and give a scholarship to students in the psychology department that were deserving from an academic standpoint. So that was a pretty cool thing to... But there's definitely some elements of self-aggrandizement, I think he would be a good politician. How about that? All right, so that's Zimbardo and Milgram and Ash.